I'm Brian Mast, Congressman of Florida's 18th Congressional District, which encompasses all of St. Lucie County, all of Martin County, and half of Palm Beach County. 2 years ago, I got to come here and talk about the things that I wanted to do as potentially the next member of Congress. This year, I get to talk about the promises kept, the things that I did do over the last year and a half. And those things range across a broad variety of issues, but hands down, the biggest issues that I've worked on were, number one, our veterans. I opened up the first congressional office in a VA hospital anywhere across the country. Very proud of that opportunity to go and serve our veterans in their turf, on their ground at the VA facility. And it's something that I'm now working on replicating across the breadth of this country, where all members of Congress go out there and have an office in their VA medical centers. I made it a promise that I would go out there and work against the train, the additional 36 routes of high-speed rail that are trying to get forced into this community each and every day. And I've done extensive work on that on the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure, and we're working against those issues. And the biggest issue, hands down, that I work on is repairing our broken systems of waterways here across all three of these counties. The water that flows out of Lake Okeechobee into the Treasure Coast of Florida that destroys our coastal estuaries. That work is done for me as the Vice Chairman of the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee, where I was able to pass a lot of pieces of legislation that really work towards getting the appropriations towards these projects so that they can be fixed, and also getting bills out there to address problems that are surrounding all the local tributaries to try to prevent the runoff that goes into these waterways and causes the disastrous algal blooms that we face. So there are a number of reforms that I've worked on as it relates to immigration over the past couple of years. Just a couple of weeks ago, we voted on a bill in Congress that addressed a number of parts of immigration, from making sure that children that are brought into this country illegally with their families when they're trying to smuggle them in, that they do have the opportunity to stay together and when they're in these detention facilities, that they're not separated, from making sure that those children that are part of Deferred Action for Child Arrival, that DACA program, that they have a pathway towards knowing what their future is, that they have a certainty with their future. And what that looked like was this. So there was a trigger in this bill that says once the border wall, the southern border security program of that wall was brought to completion, that any children that are under that DACA program would have the opportunity to then pursue a green card and have that pathway towards citizenship. It also addressed things like chain migration and visa lottery and a number of other things as it relates to border and port security. And so it's one of the biggest things that I think that we've worked on in this 115th Congress. So the issue of firearms, and especially in the wake of what happened in Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, what happened in Orlando with Omar Mateen, what happened in Las Vegas with Stephen Paddock, it's probably been one of the things I've been most outspoken about. And it touches me personally. I lost somebody, I lost a friend in what occurred in the shooting in Parkland, Florida. And I think probably one of the biggest divides that we face in this country are people retreating to their corners and not willing to recognize all sides of this issue. We have on one side of the issue the fact that we do have a Second Amendment right. This is a founding of our nation, and people want to say this isn't a right that we should have, and that want to deteriorate that right. And on the other side of the issue, we have folks that aren't necessarily willing to acknowledge that there are various levels of lethality that exist with the different firearms platforms that exist out there, and the various levels of lethality that exist that can allow for these shootings to produce more casualties than what they otherwise could have. And this is something that I tell people, it's very fair and it's very constitutional for us to look at who has access to which arms and what we're doing about how they have access to those arms, and acknowledge the fact, as our late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia mentioned, that not all persons have access to every single arm and on any given day. And this is one of the things that we have to work towards. I wrote a bill on this immediately after Parkland that defined an assault-style rifle, that said a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle with a rifled bore. That's the kind of weapon that I'd carried in combat, an M4 carbine, which is also very similar to your ARs and your Kalashnikovs, and I said that we need to look at the way that these are sold and address things out there, from what we do about people with mental illness, what we do with those that have criminal backgrounds, and especially those juvenile backgrounds that are not uploaded into our National Criminal Instant Background Check system, what we do about drug testing, and what we do about so many other things, to say that we need to be wise about the people that are purchasing firearms so that we don't have these instances that occur with these very, very evil and sick individuals like Stephen Paddock, like Omar Mateen, like Nicholas Cruz, and so many others. And it's a big thing that I like to work on, especially being that it touched my home so personally. So when it comes to tax cuts and infrastructure investment, it's probably one of the biggest things that I've had the opportunity to work on in terms of committees in Congress. So I do sit on the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure, where we do so much in looking at the various infrastructures that need to be built out there, from infrastructure locally here, like the repair of the dike around Lake Okeechobee, which we fully funded, and in the future, a southern reservoir to store water coming out of Lake Okeechobee, which we recently authorized on my committee and on my subcommittee. And when you talk about the tax cuts program that we put into law out there, I'm fully supportive of it. It's incredible for our community. It's incredible for our state and our country. I give the examples of these. You know, if you take a person out there that's earning $30,000, you know, their taxes went from paying 15% tax down to paying 12% tax. Or maybe somebody out there, a man or woman who's making $80,000 a year, their taxes, their top bracket went from paying 25% down to 22%. Or maybe you have a couple out there that's making $180,000 a year. Their taxes went from paying 28% down to 24%. Those are some really big cuts. And when you add in some of the other provisions out there that are related to the tax cuts program, the doubling of the standard deduction, you know, where that 0% bracket, that part that's knocked off the top of somebody's taxes, was doubled from $6,000 to $12,000 for somebody that's single filing as an individual, or from $12,000 to $24,000 for somebody that's married and filing jointly. That's a really big cut for everybody out there. And then I think one of the most important things that really touches so many lives around here is the doubling of the child tax credit. You know, we took that child tax credit that exists out there in our community, per the IRS's own numbers, for about 42,000 families that file the tax credit for 1, 2, 3, 4, however many children that they have. It was $1,000. We doubled that to $2,000. So if you look at that and you have an expectant parent out there that takes that child tax credit of $2,000, saves it for their child from birth to age 18, they just saved up $36,000 for their child's first home, or for their education, or for them to be entrepreneurs and start their own business. So I think the tax cuts have been a really outstanding program for Florida and the community and every individual across this community in general. You know, I just tell people as I wrap this up that it's been an absolute honor to serve this community as their representative in the 115th Congress. I tell people that I think the most important things that I learned about serving wherever it is that I serve, I learned during my time in the military. And the most important lessons that I learned in the military were this. Number one, I learned from great leaders that you never ask your men to do something that you wouldn't be willing to do yourself, or that you hadn't already done yourself. That has to be the pinnacle trait of good leadership, and it's the way that I try to conduct my office, the way that I try to operate each and every day. And I think the most important lesson that I've learned out of leadership, it comes from the friends that I've lost during my time in service, of which I've lost, unfortunately, many. And it's this, you know, not one of my friends that left this world, they did so because they were thinking about personal gain, or they were worried about what they were going to get out of something, or they were worried about personal sacrifices where they were in the field of combat. They were always thinking about what was this going to do for their brother and their sister to their left and right in combat, and what was this going to do for their country. And that's the way that you go out there and you represent this country. It's how I try to do it every single day, is give that due respect to those service members who served in that way every single day that I've known in my whole life, and make sure that I serve in that way continually, without regard for personal gain and without regard for any personal sacrifice. And I hope that the people of this district can find that that's the way that I've conducted myself.